All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alyssa Karpinka, and I'm the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. Just to note that this event is being live streamed, so please be aware of the webcam to your right. I'd also like to take a moment to encourage you to silence your phones for the duration of the event. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of Tulpa Mea Culpa by Garry Thomas Morse and published by At Bay Press. Thank you to Garry for being here tonight and for working with us to create this event. I'd also like to thank Callum Wilson for joining us tonight as host. Callum Wilson is an MFA graduate from the University of Saskatchewan, where he worked on long-form weird fiction. He is the poetry editor for Quagmire magazine and also an editor and instructor for Wheaton Laurel magazine. Garry Thomas Morse has published several collections of poetry, notably discovery passages, about the history of his Kwakwaka'wakw Indigenous ancestors, shortlisted for the Governor General's Award. Prairie Harbor, a poetic epic set in Regina, was also shortlisted for a Governor General's Award. Morse's novels have gained critical attention for pushing the aesthetic envelope. He is the author of a speculative fiction series called The Chaos Quincunx, and 2 of its 3 books have been nominated for the Relit Award. He is also the author of 2 well-storied novels, Death in Vancouver and Yams Do Not Exist. I'll now turn things over to Garry. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thanks for coming out, everybody. And thanks, Callum, for being here. And thank you, Alyssa. So I'm going to, this book is split into 3 sections. So I'm going to read a little bit from each section. The first part is about this character called Gelhorn, and he's doing a residency in a dynamic metropolis and in Canada. And he's scandalized for reasons he can't quite figure out, something to do with the internet. And so he's being questioned by these 2 chairs, chair 1 and chair 2, that are with the university. And so just as a trigger warning, this is kind of a Me Too thing about lobsters. So I just want to warn you. Make sure. The problem was that a student just shy of 23 had been innocently swiping through randos on his phone when, out of nowhere, he had been ambushed by Gelhorn's full name, floating atop a heavily codified blacklist of male authors targeted by the toxic Avengers who were righting wrongs by blue light in the dead of night. With vision blurring, the student had stumbled off the streetcar and had immediately heaved up his guts on the cusp of Chinatown. There was no way for him to unsee what he had seen. In a year, he would be a man, but at what price? Gellhorn could only speculate that one of his brief and unfortunate marriages to a pretty fantasist was at the root of it, although some nemesis hack must have decided to exploit this misunderstanding to kneecap him or permanently put him out of the running for very small honoraria, if not awards. Chair 1, who was on sabbatical and not officially there, adopted the omelet approach. On the whole, this movement was sizzling on the griddle, so what was the big deal if a few Humpty Dumptys were broken along the way, especially if the red tide bits of shell were being picked out? Officially or not, her voice would be heard and heeded. So let's try to imagine this has got this Mediterranean air to it. Sure, you may think of yourself as an eye drop in the ocean, but soon you're post-larva in a crack beneath the cobble. For some years, you wave your swimmerettes and stalk amphipods and isopods no larger than the size of shrimp, with no one to tell their troubles to. As an adolescent, you were already showing your swagger, your first signs of male arrogance as you outgrow your crevice. Your belly full, you're ready to reproduce. If we are to believe the expertise of a number of men, the whole courtship business is terribly touching. The female seeks out the largest, or in this case, the most prolific male before releasing a powerful pheromone outside his den or office. Admit it, you're a glutton for the slightest smell of sex, fanning that pheromone until you're all worked up into quite the state. Then we can see the undeniable echoes of systemic patriarchal violence, unless we're to condone the merciless love taps or vicious jabs involved in their boxing match of the sexes, the purpose of which is to see how weak the little woman is, or in literal terms, how ready to break. Raised in a society that had conditioned her to wag her antennules about and pee on demand an aphrodisiac fragrance without giving a second thought, she really has no option but to try and bag the nearest behemoth, even if he turns out to be anything from a piranha to a poetaster. Is it enough to veil herself to the male? No, it is not. She is then subject to the most humiliating vulnerability, undergoing a Pygmalion, with the emphasis on pig, transformation. Her claws hollow out, her muscles shrink. She has to squeeze out of her shell as if it were an antique corset. Don't buy into all that rhetoric about loosening up the old shell to have a new lease on life. Ecdysis is awfully exhausting. Once she's done, she has no skeletal support and merely flops around like a raveled rag to make use of more colorful poacher jargon. She has to rely on a hydrostatic skeleton. Imagine an aquatic sex swing, just to keep you interested. Oh, you cannot deny being interested. She is destined to be your next mate or your next meal. Then, if you're prepared to do the noble thing, she turns over onto her back to receive the sperm packet in a process hailed by male observers as the most gentle and poignant experience on the planet. But that is not enough, you great red beast. You can't resist making a postcoital snack of her molt or sloughed shell. Just as there is no evidence that she was pressured to shack up with you, there's no evidence that she doesn't get kicked out after only a week, according to the same researchers. What has she to look forward to? Pushing 10,000 to 20,000 eggs out of her ovaries and through the sperm cup, marked by a small triangle at the base of her walking legs, because one pair of legs was never enough for you. She carts the eggs around on her tail for 9 to 11 months until she can finally let them float off with the sea currents. Meanwhile, what can you do but broaden the scope of your harem, kickstarting a bunch of serial flings, each of which lasts no longer than 2 weeks? You can claim there was a seduction drug dropped in the drink, but how can the same story wash for so many lady lobsters? Is this serial polygamy or a pattern of chronic misogyny? Chair 1 stopped. She was unofficially out of breath. Chair 2 picked up the oddball and ran with it. Larval bottom feeder or lustful lobster, there were protocols, if not explicit policies. The road to contrition was bound to be a long one, so the best thing would be to roll up the old sleeves and start digging in. A statement had been drafted by a progressive teaching assistant, already approved by 2 leading members of OLE, the Organization for Love and Empathy, and with a limited amount of personalization could be his to distribute before the dinner bell. The way forward would be to begin with the students and faculty members attending his weekly lecture, making a formal apology to them for having exhibited anything resembling the privileged behavior of blue-blooded crustaceans. The next logical step would be for him to pick up his pillory in the metaphorical and not the literal sense, the latter would be absurd, and announce himself to any members of their outstanding academic community as a PDM, a potentially dangerous male. And so I'll start with that part, and on to the next section. So that was a lot about lobsters. Quiet tonight. Too quiet. Okay, so in the middle part, there's a lot of different sections. There's a sort of story about a guy named Thomas Clack, who is a deceased author. And there's a chair who is above the other 2 chairs. He's like a super chair. And he's kind of doing a scholarly work on that author, and he's going through all these different fragments of writing. And so one of them that I really like is myself is called Night Treasure, and it's this long section that I was living in Regina in a condo on the edge of the prairie, sort of. It seemed like the edge of the city. And I was I don't know, I kind of was thinking, I was looking at the moon all the time, listening to Ravel, and I began to imagine all this weird stuff about like sea creatures in the slough, or some people believe in. And so this is kind of a weird journal where this guy goes off his meds and he kind of is imagining some kind of agent, and he's seeing all kinds of stuff. So I'll read a little bit of this. There are grasshoppers humming, or more accurately, churring in the soil. Apparently they produce sound for the purpose of attracting the opposite sex, rubbing a row of pegs or teeth on the overlapping front wing across the scraper, a stridulatory ridge on the upper posterior margin of the underlying front wing. The noise produced is amplified by a tightly stretched circular surface that forms a drumhead on the underlying front wing. A resonating chamber is formed between the wings and the abdomen when the latter is depressed for sound production. With respect to my own intromittent organ, the male grasshopper has a fairly impressive adagus, which he uses to leave a sort of sperm packet in a storage sac at the end of the female grasshopper's oviduct. The sperm enters the eggs through canals that are lovely at that time of year, and when they are fertilized, the female inserts them into the soil with her ovipositor. Putting aside the 180 they do in the egg, a grasshopper will hatch as a smaller adult and molt in a number of stages as an instar until after the final molt when it becomes an image and adult proper. Once the respective sexes have fulfilled their end of the amatory bargain, they die. As for an instar between molts waiting to slough off yet another skin, I wonder if he remembers what has happened before that point, or if anyone ever bothers to ask if he was asleep. As for me, I'm a bit here and there, forgetting why precisely I'm feeling okay. There was nothing of incident to relate today, aside from the fact that I suffered a slight burn on my right hand. I was doing up a simple chicken stir fry and I was concentrating on the oyster mushrooms that are grown locally, inside those great big things on planks or shelves. The stove is très moderne, at least for me, and instead of an element that appears and is hot, there's a surface that is invisibly hot. There's a light on to indicate that the surface is hot or still hot, even after you turn off all the stove dials. I suppose it was meditating on the unique character of the oyster mushrooms, or even how they had shrunk into the texture of the pan's contents. I'd let the spoon dream its own tinny dream, spooning up against that hot surface, and then the pangs of hunger reminded me to reach for one plate with my left hand and then reach for the spoon with my right hand, and then the plate landed on the counter, thus saving a few rutabagas, but the spoon flipped and landed on the floor, and then the cold water was running over my right hand before I really grasped what had happened. This became a rather solemn meal, with her voice in my ear casting a lick of judgment. I say her, thinking that la poêle is feminine, crying out, "Oh yes, why don't you watch out? The surface is hot. Can't you see how hot the surface is for those oyster mushrooms? Why did you touch me like that when it was so hot? Quelle surprise, it's always the same with you." And sometimes having a short fuse under duress, I'd flare up, but right away my abdomen was depressed for sound production. I felt awful as the wet behind the ears dissolute poet says, for not seizing this opportunity more feverishly. And now, because of me, we might return in exile or in bondage, but unable to stare my membrane in the face. It is not like the woman lifting her hood and pawing at the glass and admonishing me for the mark of my hand as if in ecstasy over her fading movements at the height of my conflicted delight. A layer of dermis had burned clean right off. No, what's the difference that my right hand looks like she kissed it wearing thistle lipstick and the parting of her lips formed a crescent moon. I really should be sleeping. I did give it a try, but the moon is nearly full and gleaming down on my pillow. Of course, there are a few things turning over in my mind. Today was once again uneventful. The temperature dropped. Snow in mid-April. No women in sight. 2 men, a jogger and a cyclist, quickly gave up on account of the wind. I watched them from one of the little bridges before returning inside myself. I've been wondering about the contents of the folder that was inside the box. At first, I thought it was part of a feeble attempt at a novel for young adults, or what they're now calling new adults for the over 20 set, but the slightly misanthropic tone felt out of place. It could be an encoded message, and I'm not giving up on that possibility, even if I'm unable to divulge its secret. It could also be the product of an unbalanced mind, something rattled off by one of my confederates. Yes, I've seen similar cases in the past. My pet theory is that the document in question is a casual entreaty that serves an ulterior motive in conjunction with a different operation. Whether this operation has overlap with my being stationed at this abandoned lighthouse remains to be seen. I hazarded opening the box in the closet and drawing out a single folder before closing and stashing the box again. Inside there are pictures featuring a young woman with dark hair who is modeling a variety of graphic novel and movie characters, including a vampire, a huntress, a fairy, and some kind of mythical creature I didn't quite recognize. Inside was her measurements. Included was her measurements and a short statement about herself, including her love of cosplay and her ambition to get more heavily into underwater genre stuff. Nary a day over 19, and here she was with everything popping out all over the place. I pored over the pictures trying to place her because I felt certain I'd seen her around town. A pretty face, but otherwise not that memorable. Okay, so we're going to go to the third part.
Oh, Bruno Schultz.
Cool. Okay. Okay, so in the third part, there's a lot about a woman who's a police clerk named Petra Quest, and she gets mixed up with one of these sort of Tulpa-like characters. She's not sure who she's following, a double or what she's doing. And so she's given information for a police report. And there's a lot of characters with the police, and they're interpreting her dreams and they're interpreting what her testimonial. And they write their own versions. Sometimes there's one person that wants to write for TV, like a space opera kind of sci-fi thing. And another one's about like a a different kind of genre. So I'll read a little bit of this. It's sort of so for whatever reason she wanted to write about androids, this other character, and so there's a little piece in here that's kind of like a sci-fi thing. So I'll read a bit of that. It might sound familiar to you. Prue made herself moderately comfortable at Lonely's. The server approached her with an air of suspicion that formed a wispy cloud over his weariness. She flashed him her friendliest grin and sent him back for a Spinoza. Sometimes the owner was present, but was clearly not on this dead night. It would be better that way. The server returned with her drink, and Prue looked him up and down. Any deals on grub? Sorry, the cook went home early. Not even a nibble? Patrons at this hour don't want food. Try the bistro around the corner. Affable. So you don't do quail and eggs? Very funny. Is that a street drug? I heard there was once a peregrine falcon that was grounded by hail. They kept her in a medium-sized cage until she recovered. Every day at 4 on the dot, they fed her quail and eggs. That sounds truly epic, but I don't see. Eventually, she did improve and flew back to her roots on top of the radish building. A male falcon was waiting for her. In spite of temptation the male faced, she had not missed her chance. She had not missed her chance? To mate, to reproduce. Maybe eating all that quail helped, but you don't do quail and eggs, do you? Never mind. The thing about her was her little face, so expressive, more human than humans. Maybe that's why she was so popular. Oh, Colleen. Patrons at this hour don't want food. Not at all. Try affable. Around the corner? Sure, but first I've got another one. Ever hear about the invalid who got stuck in a jam? There was still an outmoded subroutine that went something like this. Here I be, but being an elite erotobot is still my jam. He tried to dedicate all his resources to his new gig, but they're still part of his deep encoding on the hustle. Then one morning out of the blue, this damselfly comes into the joint and asks for quail and eggs. Good gravy. Who got the gravy there? Well, you can guess how that turned out. No, to answer your question, patrons of this hour don't want food. Never mind, I have only one question. Do you ever do quail and eggs? The server turned color, his lips fishbowling air. Prue stood up and raised her scramble jam. An ubique field formed a glowing net and closed around the server. She watched as his reasoning faculties were displaced. No matter how sophisticated the pseudo-organic spanner, it could not grapple with an ubique assault on its artificial nervous system. In fact, no one could. Just a little more of this. The next stop was Baroque. Prue made her way to a dimly lit table, clashing with the mincing step of a pasakai. A server approached, not so different from the last guy, except for his powdered wig and faux mole. Prue sized him up carefully. You got Spinoza? Sure, but our Freud is on special. Fine. Say, where can I get some castrato action? Ha, nowhere. We do have a wonderful selection of boy sopranos or countertenors galore. Look, I didn't come here for treble. I heard you could do better. You're not the fuzz? Nope, just another gal in search of a few thrills. Then I might have something in that vein if you would be so good as to follow me. The server led Prue past a row of booths obscured by burgundy curtains. Mostly she could hear a dulcet alto or deep mezzo crooning in combination with anthro expletives. The server left her in the booth at the very back and went to fetch her flute of Freud. A young man in nothing but a loin cheater appeared on the other side of the plexiglass partition. He did not look a day over 19. The server returned with a drink and leaned in to speak in hushed tones. This model is as close to the real thing as you can get these days, far less grotesque, even so anatomically incorrect. A spanner? What else? Just remember, it costs extra if you want to touch him through the plexiglass. I'll try to control myself. You'd be surprised what goes on in these booths. Many a hard-faced customer loses his or her heart to one of these babies. The server left and the spanner launched right into Vivaldi's Cessate, oh my, cessate. Prue listened while she considered her options. She certainly knew the fastest way to get through the protective barrier. Even so, halfway through the aria, her thoughts became confused. She had not even touched her Freud, and yet her knees were feeling wobbly. There was not much choice but to roll with it. She pressed her body against the plexiglass and indulged in a sham rapture. However, she was planting the nanoscopic charges beneath steamy kisses. Her rapture turned real. The spanner, perhaps out of a sense of self-preservation, switched from Vivaldi to Handel, whose Lascia Ch'io Piange went straight to her pelvis. Even when the plexiglass curdled into transparent blossoms, the machine went on singing, penetrating her with a kind of note she had never known before. What did the words mean? Something like, here flow my tears. No more like, leave me to weep. That's my idea of freedom. A sustained note at the end of Libertà pieced her to the core, and she fell to her knees, dropping the scramble jam. The spanner saw its chance and charged. Prue rolled out of the way and went for a bag, drawing out a trade trig. A burly customer came out of a booth and bumped into the spanner, keeping it within range. Prue fired, striking head and back and right thigh. 3 quick jolts resulted in 3 pseudo-organic implosions. Head, chest, and thigh burst open. The server reappeared and looked down at the mess. Lady, you break, you buy. Okay, that's enough of that.
Oh, yeah, just push and just hold down that, and then it'll turn green.
Like that. Awesome. Thank you very much, Gary. That was fantastic. And thank you, McNally Robinson, for having us here, and thank you all for coming to the book launch for Tulpa Mea Culpa. Now, I've got some questions for you. One, there seems to be a lot of invertebrate sex in this book. Did you have to do a lot of like research into invertebrates, or like where did that come from?
Yes, invertebrate sex has always fascinated me. No, I don't know. I just sort of like it's sort of my own interest. Like I think mainly I got interested very much in grasshoppers when I lived in Regina for a year, and they're all around, and I'm from the West Coast, and you just don't see them over there. And so it's really, I became interested in all their life cycle. And so part of it, as you may have gathered, there's this whole thing about sloughing of skin, and that's probably the thing that interests me the most, because I keep, like Samuel Beckett had this idea of the author, where the author has all these identities, or they can kind of change into another identity. And so it's a little like that, where you're imagining the ultimate self is casting off all these different layers. And so I kind of found probably an analogy in those things, like a lobster, the grasshopper, androids.
Yeah, all creatures that molt.
Yeah,
Including androids, I suppose.
sure.
If they're the ones that molt.
They can do anything.
And I wanted to ask you about the title, Tulpa Mea Culpa. Now, my limited research into the word tulpa, there are 2 definitions. There's the Tibetan term, which is more like a thought form or a spirit, and then there's the theosophic definition, which is what we typically tend to today, which is sort of like an imaginary friend. Was there any, like, did you consider like the different definitions of tulpa, or did you like meditate on the different meanings of tulpa?
Well,
How does tulpa come into play in the book?
Yeah, I think the most I got from like all people who watch David Lynch's Twin Peaks: The Return every night. He was using them a little bit like doppelgangers, and so there's this idea in it of people had all these tulpas were kind of they seem to be some extension of the mind. And my understanding is I came to learn that they're also used sometimes in psychology, that someone can invent like sort of like an imaginary friend, and it can be have therapeutic value. And so this is more an idea of having something in the mind that's manifest, where you have another self that's wandering around doing all kinds of weird stuff. That's a way of understanding how, I don't know, but just, so I think that this definition is almost like a projection or a double is sort of how to think of it and for use in the book.
And what do you think your tulpa would be up to right now?
Oh, something more interesting, but yes, I don't know. It's probably, I think the element of like the Jungian sense of like a dark part of the psyche would be a way of exploring it too. That's why I'm interested in as well. Like the tulpa could probably do all this stuff that you don't do as you're living in a society, or you observe norms, or you split off your darker impulses into brighter ones. So
The shadow.
Yeah, that's right. The shadow self. That's
And as well, because this is sort of an esoteric or almost occult text, they're often read occult texts in conversation with one another, or their responses to one another. Like any philosophical text, they require a wide breadth of scholarship. And Marina Endicott described this book as a kaleidoscope of literary references. But do you think one needs to be a literati to enjoy this book?
I wouldn't say so. Like I did one a novel called Yams Do Not Exist, and it was basically a lot of Samuel Beckett's early, quite decadent style applied to the prairies, to Regina and Winnipeg. And so I admit it's a very challenging book because of that style, even though it's just about everyday stuff. This one, I don't think the style is overly challenging. I think it's generally, it may be a tome that if you can get it home, then you will be able to read through and get something. Like I thought this is sort of, I don't like to use the word accessible, but it's readable for me. And so it's not too lost in language to not have. It's like many stories. Would you agree that
I would
there's lots
agree,
of
yes.
stories in it?
Like
So,
imagos or doubles and
yeah, there's a
and-
lot of doubling. That's the thing.
and phrases that sort of stand in for things from other works of literature. And so I think, yeah, have an encyclopedia handy if you're interested. But from what I've read, it's just fantastic to read, and I just mark it down where when I have a question, then I come back to it later. I have one more question. And we were talking about it a little bit earlier about film and television. And I noticed in page 65, your narrator says, I would have liked to fade out here. And I said, oh, well, like film does kind of haunt text now. Would you say that literature like should or must sort of adopt or interact with film and new forms of media if it wants to, I guess, survive as a form of media, or should it sort of stick more to it? It's like, how do you decide, I guess, how much of film and how much of other forms of art to reference in your book?
Well, I think about what the French author Nathalie Sarraute, she talked about this like in the early 20th century, mid 20th century, about how with the advent of cinema, like the novelist faced new challenges. And so it was like, she felt you should really do something different with the novel that couldn't be done with cinema, even though I know today the trend is to try to, I want to write something for Netflix, and will be instantly. And the people do that. They have in Toronto, there's a whole bunch of people that hang out and do that. But I think I'm trying to do the opposite. Like, I think you should do something you have all this freedom to create sensations and ideas and things that maybe can't be filmed. And that's something I'm trying to do. Yes, but yeah, I like the idea of a fade out, which is interesting too.
Film haunts text, but I agree. This book is mostly about what can be done with text and things that can't be done visually. I know about Yams Don't Exist. When you're mentioning Samuel Beckett, Murphy by Samuel Beckett, it's one of my favorite books.
Oh,
So I would love to read.
Let's get a room.
decadent. Yeah.
And we'll hash this out. It's like, yeah, Murphy is actually one of my favorites. So I just thought they have a copy at the library. And it's just like, I was like, oh, they got Murphy. Because it's like one of my, but that was, yeah, something that really, it's very touching too, even though it's got a sort of odd style, like,
Decadent's a good word for it, but it is incredibly touching.
yeah. So I don't know. I find that I have a soft spot for Beckett's Murphy. So if you get this book, pick that up as well. But yeah, no, that's a wonderful text. Yeah. Let's talk about Beckett a little bit. Do you want to ask anything else about Beckett? No.
I mean,
Sorry, I didn't mean-
no, that's okay. There's just so much about Beckett. What do you think of the chess scene in Murphy? Let's just talk about somebody else's book for a little bit.
Yeah. No, you're talking about Yams Don't Exist. So I guess so that was something I was applying the decadent style of early novelist Beckett, which in my view, he becomes more minimalist as he goes along, and he gets to this point where it's all about the breaking down of form. But the early stuff is also, it's like kind of really beautiful and excessive, like everything's over described. And so he was kind of doing something with novelistic convention. And I like that as a form too, to over describe stuff. And so not just to pare it down to simple phrases, but to try to maybe overdo it. I'm prone to exaggeration.
It's the sheer engineering of language, which I also see in Tulpa Mea Culpa. But let's open up some questions to the floor.
Sure.
Yes, on the subject of Beckett, so as somebody that writes like absurd, speculative, weird kind of fiction, I'm constantly being referred to Beckett, but I actually have never read Beckett, so I didn't know like why I keep getting referred to Beckett, who I just know by I don't know, that can't even remember the play, the Godot play.
Oh, yeah.
Wait for Godot, thank you, yeah. Why do I keep getting referred to Beckett?
Well, I don't want to do, I'm not gonna trash Godot here, but I'm gonna say that what the thing about Godot that I think is often missed is that it's almost like all of his works were kind of leading to this bare stage where he was removing stuff from the stage to almost nothing. So if you go back to something a little earlier, like Mercier and Camier, it's about these two dudes, this kind of pseudo couple, and they wander around, and it's just really fun, and it's kind of, I like that as a kind of fun thing. I'm not sure why the absurdist people keep directing you to him, but necessarily, but absurdism is something we were gonna touch upon, I think. But that's an interesting thing in itself. It's not quite humor, but it's something that's just really offbeat or strange, and it's yeah. I'll say, okay, instead of talking about Beckett, I'll say I like this director, and I don't know how to pronounce his first name, Andrzej Zulawski, and he's best known for this film called Possession, but he's done a lot of weird things, like he did Witold Gombrowicz did a cool novel. He's a good absurdist. Witold Gombrowicz, he's a Polish author. He did a thing called Cosmos, and then Zulawski did a film of it, and it's just so absurd. It's branded as a comedy, but it's actually so absurd and weird, and people say such strange stuff, and I find it amazing. So I'll plug Gombrowicz and Zulawski instead of Beckett. Read them tonight. Watch them tonight.
Find them here.
So you said Tulpa Mea Culpa here is, I guess, meant to be its own like standalone piece of literature, independent from other forms of media. Kind of give you an experience that you can't get from like TV or songs or music. Like you have to read it firsthand. That kind of got me wondering if you were to, I guess, prepare it to be transposed into another form of media. What are some key things you would focus on or even change about it in order to do so?
Well, that's interesting. I'm working with something like that right now, which is not like, yeah, obviously it'll be like, oh, how can I make this a movie? But one of my friends here, Meredith Hamrock, is she's helping me about my screenwriting, and so I've been working on little bits of fragments to try to take those pieces that you're saying and putting them, like even from some of these characters and situations, and redoing them and creating a new kind of mirroring between the text of the narrative and then the text of the budding screenplay, which will probably never be finished, like all great projects. And so I am kind of working on that to try to relate to that form, because it's something I don't understand about. But like, I've been an outsider to movies looking in, and now as I start to enter into even little scenes, it's like something's going on. It's like a mind altering drug. It's my psychedelic to do that. So screenwriting, yeah. So that's yeah, I can put in whatever, but I like, yeah, absurdism and yeah, what you're saying, that'd be cool to try to do that. So I am trying to do that right now, actually. I got a thing going on, a Saskatoon narrative, and then there's this, it keeps the Tulpa elements keep being reintroduced in new forms. And so I'm trying to relate.
So what kind of challenges have popped up when you're doing that?
It's mostly my own slowness to try to relate to scripting, which is a very different. It's fascinating, the difference between the literary and the scripting, and trying to contrast those, and even that's kind of like a thing, like the experimental is to try to test out those theories. And so yeah, that's a challenge to try to think maybe in terms of images or something like the thing I always remember is on Billy Wilder was working with Raymond Chandler on Double Indemnity, and then he kept getting mad at him and drinking and going, and I don't know, he didn't hit him over the head, but he's kind of mad because Chandler would write some amazing literary prose, and he'd be like, this is not how you open a scene. And it would be something like that. And so there is a big difference between how we see how film is done or TV, and how the literary, where you have all this room to just kind of go off on a frolic of your own. So Meredith.
Hi. Can I just ask you about process? Because you mentioned there's 3 big chunks in the book, and so I'm just wondering how you approached writing that and how you feel they interact, I guess.
Well, I can describe kind of just verbatim as the first part is this text you're presented with. It's really about this guy Gelhorn and his double. So he has a physical double. It's sort of like a Russian thing, like Dostoevsky, Nabokov, Saramago. And so he has a double, and he's an actor, and he's this poet, and so he's kind of all about that. And then the middle part is about this guy, the the writer that's passed away or he's departed, and he seemed to have written that first part, and so it starts to and then the third part is about the police clerk that doesn't know who she's dealing with. Is she dealing with one of the doubles? Is she dealing with that author that's gone? And who is that guy in her bus? And she follows him around and gets into a sort of semi-romantic entanglement, and it gets more and more confusing because he's got a journal and she gets sucked into that. So there's a lot of playfulness with texts and more text nesting. I love nesting. It's just, and that comes from whether it's the Irish part or the Kwak because they love these really wacky narratives that go all over the place. And so I like the text to keep taking you into new and new digressions and things. So that's sort of where I'm going with process. So, but there's a lot about process of writing within it, I think. So.
And did you worry at all about like confusing people, or do you feel like that is kind of intentionally part of it to sort of get lost with the writer?
Yeah, I think I'm okay with that. Like, I think I'm cool with that. I think we all should be a little confused.
I'm always confused about
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
So that's, you know, I feel that's to my advantage, actually. So, yeah. Questions?
What do you think the biggest difference between screenplay writing and fiction writing is? Like, if there's one big difference, then mark the two as separate.
Probably description. Well, no, that's not even a thing, but it's I think actually it's the economy of space, because you have so maybe there's a little bit more correlation between poetry and script writing, so that like you have to really concentrate what you're doing into, say, dialogue or something. Like, you don't want to, and not overdo it. So you don't even have the luxury of like being going on off like poetry can have all this fancy language, but the script writing needs some more everyday conversation often. And so yeah, economy of space, you're having to put everything down. Each page is about a minute, so you're trying to, so you have to really concentrate. Literature, you can just go off and do this kind of stuff.
You can let people be confused.
Yeah, you can make stuff is too heavy to post. It's great. Yeah.
Are there any virtual audience members?
Yeah, do they have questions?
There are a few, but they have not said anything.
Okay.
Quiet
Well,
but
welcome.
supportive.
Pauline, do you have a question? Anything to say?
Other than that, I have not familiarized myself with this.
I just want to say that Colleen's like my greatest reader. Like, she loves all the language, so she's read some like 7. She's like fantastic poet, and I wish if there were more readership like Colleen in Canada, I would cry myself to sleep a little less at night. So that's actually sorry.
I'm glad you explained a little bit on what tulpa means, because I thought it was just sort of some Latin rhyme for
Yeah.
culpa.
Well, it is. It's a little like a spell in a way. We were talking about this before the reading, and so it's a little bit like it sort of has a feeling of, but it's also sort of like almost like I'm sorry for my tulpa, my bad. You know, it's sort of got that
But
feeling.
my double's bad.
Yeah, it's kind of like sorry. Yeah, that's what happens.
Yeah. My shadow made you cry.
Sorry, not sorry.
My
That's
shadow
why.
made you cry.
Yeah, that's
And I'm
nice.
And I'm happy about that.
Oh wow, that sounds like it would win something.
Thank you. I didn't know what tulpa was tonight.
Yeah, well, my mother, who's Indigenous, she thought it was. She sort of had it associated with more like this magical lore and something to do with the world. So that's cool.
I get mistaken frequently for like physical.
Yes, that happened to me. There's a few people that thought I was some guy named Max, and they kept confusing it with me at university, and that was why. So I did put a Max and just for yeah. So there's
Manitoba, because my roots are there, but I frequently get. I guess I have that kind of face. I'm not sure. I thought
and I'm like Max. Oh.
So yeah, I'm glad my daughter is quite unique.
Do you have a question there?
It's you in the back. Do you have a question?
I mean, you got me thinking, like, are grasshoppers really that rare? You said you didn't see any grasshoppers, so you moved to prairie.
Oh, I do, well, I do, I in the west, are there grasshoppers on the west coast, or they're in the Yukon, I went up there. They aren't around all the time, like, if you go out a little ways, I'm sure you see them, but like in Vancouver, though, it's, did you see them all the time, Meredith, when you're in Vancouver? Thank you for corroborating my. Especially these big, like, big, yeah.
Have you seen the
On
one?
toast.
Oh, I like the description.
Cool.
Looking to close things up.
Sure.
All right, if there are no more questions, I'll just say a quick word before I let you go. I'd like to thank Garry and Callum again for being with us tonight. We have copies of Tulpa Mea Culpa available on the desk to your right. And if you'd like your copy signed, or if you'd like to say hello, I'm sure Garry will be happy to meet you at the signing table. Thank you all for coming out tonight and enjoy the rest of your evening.
What's your favorite grasshopper? Now that the